I can see people, there's a long line of people to buying Ben's book, and they're still trickling in. So I'll just stall a little bit on the way here. I'm really happy to be here. Ben is genuinely one of my favorite journalists. It wouldn't be Sunday night with what was formerly New York Times media column, but is now the Semaphore weekly newsletter. And there's nothing I know of that is better read among the media, because Ben somehow gets scoop after scoop, juicy detail after juicy detail. And for those of you who haven't read this, we're not going to spoil it. It's such a fun read. Let me tell you what I did with this book. First of all, I called in favors to get an early copy because I was just desperate to read it. And then I got an early copy, and I looked myself up in the index, and wasn't there, which was kind of a relief if you know Ben. And then I read it in about 5 hours. And it's a super fun read. And one of the things, I had a lot of realizations reading it, because I was sort of, shall we say, on the periphery of a lot of the phenomenon Ben describes. But to think of viral media as a historical moment that is over, at least that you can write a book about it, was really, really interesting to me. It didn't occur to me that we were done with it. But that does raise the question, is viral media of the kind that you're talking about now a historical phenomenon, at least in the sense of history of media, history of journalism, or are we still doing the stuff?
Well, thank you for all the kind words. I'm sorry about one of the main reactions to the book. Andrew Sullivan wrote a very eloquent review making this point, was that there was not enough about Andrew Sullivan in it. And I think, Jake, that's a reasonable reaction, because you do have to pick and choose your fighters. Yeah, I mean, I sort of wrote the book because I guess I came up after a period at the New York Times, or I guess getting to the New York, leaving BuzzFeed, getting to the New York Times in 2020, just sort of feeling intuitively like the whole moment was over, and wondering what the hell had just happened, and wanting to go back and report it out. I mean, I guess I think of it as essentially this social media age, particularly as pertained to news, and politics and public information. I do think is over. I mean, it's not, these periods aren't cleanly delineated. Nobody like flipped the switch on Facebook and Twitter and turned them off. But if you think about how centrally, culturally relevant and politically relevant those platforms were 5-10 years ago, and now Facebook is as it used to be. Like, someone was just showing me this incredible video of a sloth, like that had survived a fire finding a baby sloth, and 10 years ago that would have been a photograph, but I think Facebook is sort of back to that. And also, when it's your own sloth or your child, also that. And Twitter is falling apart in its own way. And I don't think these are fundamentally, it's partly because of management choices and political choices at those places, but mostly I think we kind of all got sick of that as a way to communicate.
Yeah. I mean, but when you think about, not just Facebook and Twitter in a different way, but Vice, BuzzFeed, Vox, the Huffington Post, Gawker.
Yeah.
Did anybody have a good experience with digital journalism? I mean, everyone feels burned by it in one way or another. And there was a range of outcomes, but was there any good outcome?
I mean, I guess I would say I think a lot of people, including me, feel like we did a lot of great journalism and did have had in some ways a good experience. But I think there was a fundamental bet it was really a business bet that didn't pan out. And the core of the bet was that as when cable was born in the 80s, so in the 2010s with these social media platforms, there were new companies that controlled the wires of the pipes of distribution. And if you got good at serving people through those pipes, ultimately, one way or another, those companies would pay you. And it happened with cable, right? Like Comcast pays tons of money to CNN and ESPN and all these people, to HBO. And that's what happened to those companies. The Facebooks and the Twitters and everyone were totally addicted to user-generated content, to the incredible margins you get when you pay nothing, and never considered seriously a different model.
Yeah, but when you say the bet that this kind of digital, and I'm thinking now about the publications, about
Yeah.
Huffington Post, about Vice, about BuzzFeed. You made this bet, but being very candid, do you think it was a bet or a mistake to think that you could reconstitute journalism on the basis of viral flows of audience, on traffic, as opposed to the historical way journalistic institutions have been built?
Oh, I mean, it was obviously a mistake in retrospect. I mean, yeah, what do you want me to say? I mean, yeah. Although, I guess I do think you can overlearn the lessons. I mean, actually, the more serious answer is, right, was it, in a way, like, was it obviously folly, or did things just not pan out that way? Was there a different model where it became actually like a business that is the sort of, like, that is, this kind of business is, in fact, cable television? They don't have direct relationships. They go through these distributors, and that's what we thought this was going to become.
Yeah.
But no, I think that was folly. And the other, huge mistake, which some people were saying at the time, who I didn't even know existed, went back and read this apparently famous speech from 2011 by the head of the Internet Advertising Bureau, who was saying that we can't let the platforms turn what we do into pork bellies. In the advertising industry, it's like famous as the pork bellies speech. And I think we all, without thinking too hard about it, had this idea that traffic was a commodity. That, if I'm making $10, 10 cents a click, and I can get twice as many clicks, I'll make 20 cents a click, or I'll make twice as much money. And the thing about commodities is that they are limited is that there's scarcity. Yeah. And there was not scarcity of traffic, and that meant that you would get twice as much traffic and make exactly the same amount of money, which was a little disconcerting.
Right. Well, what the scarcity turns out to be attention,
right.
not production.
Right.
Right. Which flips everything on its head. But I mean, this was such a pervasive idea that essentially no one was immune to it at the height. I mean, the New York Times was chasing traffic, not necessarily in the same way the Huffington Post was, but reporters were competing to see who had more page views on their piece, and they got into the game. Now they've sort of gotten out of that game. But why did this become a ubiquitous way of thinking about how media would now work?
Well, I think that in a way, people in media had always, been hungry for an audience. And it's not like the internet invented tabloid journalism or invented ratings, right? But in a way, suddenly you were flying with the instruments switched on. And you couldn't lie to yourself and say, well, people come for this and they stay for that. Like, they don't even stay for the evening news; they're gone. And they, and you could see this with such sort of clarity that I think it prompted a lot of us to, in some ways, just over-optimize, take very literally this signal that the only thing people wanted was baby sloths.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the story you tell. Part of what's so great about this book is the conclusions are like 2 pages, and the story is like really captivating. But you focus it on the rivalry between 2 people, Jonah Peretti, who founded BuzzFeed, where you went to work, and Nick Denton, who founded Gawker. Tell us a little bit about the 2 of them, and in what way were they rivals?
Yeah, I chose them because there was this moment that, like, I think is now sort of, for me, I was also sort of peripheral to most of this between 2000 and 2012 and kind of interested in it. And one of the things that I had forgotten was there was this moment after the tech crash in 1999 to 01 in Silicon Valley, when there was this idea that California was over and the new hub of innovation would be New York City. And these sort of media tech companies like Etsy and Foursquare and like Gawker and like Huffington Post, and they would mix technology and culture. And a lot of the people bouncing around there had a lot of fun and didn't really think about what they were doing, but 2 who really sort of looked at this and said, wow, this is going to swallow all of media, were Jonah Peretti and Nick Denton. That's kind of why I chose them, because I think they did see, to some sense, where things were going, and had these very different visions. Denton saw, and Gawker sort of had this ideology that the core thing the internet could do was strip away the hypocrisy, both from stories where journalists would say one thing when they went out and had drinks at a bar, and you'd have a super interesting conversation with a journalist covering the mayor or some celebrity, and then you'd read the story and it would be so boring. And Denton's view was, no, publish the things that journalists are really think and really say to each other. And then also strip away the hypocrisy from the audience. You could see the traffic, and you could see that people liked pornography more than they liked news. So he started a porn site, like no judgments. And that was kind of his, view on the world. And Peretti had this totally different view. I mean, it evolved, but specifically that this nascent social media would be overwhelmingly positive, that people, maybe in the privacy of a Google search box, you would be searching some depraved thing. But when you were on Facebook, in public, you would obviously be your best self. And you'd be sharing articles about, be sharing cute cat pictures and articles about, how to help the victims of earthquakes and thoughtful Slate essays, not insane political screeds, because then you'd look like a crazy person to all your friends. And who would want that? And in a way, to me, like the biggest surprise in going back to that moment was this sort of like progressive utopianism of it. It was just taken for granted that the internet was for young people and progressives. That the Barack Obama campaign really was captured this energy, and a lot of people who worked online, like the Huffington Post was founded to some degree to elect Barack Obama or to elect a Democrat. And then Obama's election was seen in some ways as the culmination of the internet. Like, amazing, we did it, we're done. And he, Obama visited Facebook in 2011 to see Mark Zuckerberg, and he didn't have to say, I'm here because you guys are Democrats and this is a democratic institution. It just kind of went without saying. It was like visiting Madison, Wisconsin, or Martha's Vineyard, and that this was a liberal place. And the kind of speed with which that turned, and then the sort of clarity with which these new right-wing figures saw the power of these tools and these ideas and used them for their own ends, to me was like the real kind of vertiginous part of going back and reporting it.
So I want to talk about that in a second. First, I want to talk a little bit more about Peretti and Denton, because you describe Denton in a way I described, which is a pretty cynical character, the way I think of him. But Peretti, you describe as a more kind of positive outlook. I think of him as pretty cynical, too, in a certain way. And the whole idea that we can get people to click on this crap is kind of a cynical approach to journalism, if you want to call it that. And it is a big change from the paternalism you were talking about of this earlier stage of media, where media owners, editors think there are things that are important for citizens in a democratic society to know, and they give you foreign coverage that you don't necessarily want, and they give you substantive coverage that you don't necessarily want. And Jonah may have had the realization that what people really want is the feel-good stories and the pornography and all the populist things. But it's a pretty cynical outlook by comparison.
It's interesting because when I got there in 2012, the last thing he would have called himself was a journalist. Yeah. I don't think he saw what he was doing as journalism at all. And it was me, and he had sort of come from this very specific experience that was totally different from the way most people get into media, which is he'd come up as kind of a prankster. I mean, this is a 90s term that now feels clunky to say, but he had like culture jammer. That was this sort of anti-advertising lefty movement of the 90s that he had sort of come out of, and his formative experience was when he was grad school at MIT. He was killing time, and Nike had done something then very innovative and allowed you to, on this sort of nascent internet, put any word you wanted on the side of a sneaker. You put your name, basically. Yeah. And he tried to put the word sweatshop, and a Nike customer service representative wrote back to him and said that it violated their terms of service, and he wrote back and said, no, it doesn't. I read your terms of service. It's a word in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and they went back and forth for a long time, and he concluded the exchange by saying that he understood they wouldn't print it, but could they instead send him a photograph of the 7-year-old Vietnamese girl who had made his shoes. And thought he was super witty, and as like a super witty young man in 2002 would do, or 2000, I guess, would do, he tried to get it into the Harper's Index, and he sent it to Harper's, and they rejected it. And so instead, he forwarded it to a few friends. And email forwards were the first viral media. Yeah. And it went crazily viral. And within weeks, everyone in the country, it seemed like, had seen it. And he was on the Today Show debating a spokesman for Nike's about sweatshops, of which Jonah knew nothing. And he sort of had the unusual wisdom to realize that experience really wasn't at all about his own cleverness, but was about some new form of distribution that suddenly you could reach millions of people and get into the Today Show without owning a printing press, without having a broadcast tower, and became obsessed with chasing that. So I don't know if it's cynical or not. It's this utterly kind of orthogonal angle into the media. I think that's why he was so disruptive.
Right. But it's revealing hypocrisy. He's saying there's hypocrisy on Nike's part. There's hypocrisy everywhere in the media and
Sort of
society.
puncturing the marketing business, yeah.
Which is a version of what Denton
Yeah.
was doing, too, I would say, because Denton was saying, basically, the media's not telling you everything they know. They're part of a kind of cabal with politicians, with celebrities, and we're going to come in and break through that and give you all the gossip.
And by the way, that statement you just said has always been true,
Right.
and was really particularly true and felt true in like the year 2003 or 2004, 2005, as the cabal of the media and the politicians sold the public a war that was an incredible disaster, right? And so I think it's funny because now I do think, and I certainly write in the book about all the damage this era did, but it's easy to forget what it was reacting against and how discredited people felt the media at large, the New York Times in particular, were.
Yeah, I mean, there is a kept media phenomenon around certain industries, politics being the business, but obviously you get it with Hollywood and you get it with Silicon Valley, and that was ultimately Gawker's undoing, was trying to puncture it around Silicon Valley.
Yeah, that's right. They published a fairly harmless piece outing Peter Thiel. I mean, it was sort of gentle in a way, but I don't think you should out people. They had some fairly thin argument that, well, he's a public enough figure that he's doing a disservice. I don't know. And then the thing that really infuriated Thiel, he says, I mean, who knows if that's true, was that Denton then, in the comments of his own site, he sort of almost managed them through commenting on his writer's work, wrote this screed about how weird how weird Thiel was personally, what a strange, dark thing this was to do, and that apparently infuriated Thiel and triggered this decade-long, totally secret, and you kind of know that he knew he was doing something wrong because he kept it secret, quest to destroy Gawker by any means he could.
And that was, in a way picking up on an idea Zuckerberg expressed early in the days of Facebook, which is like, get over the idea of privacy. If you have something to hide, you shouldn't. It should be exposed, and everyone should essentially live in public. Which is a horrifying idea, which he would no longer embrace, but was sort of intrinsic to the early days of social media.
Well, there was this deep dispute, which I think is still running, about anonymity on social media. I mean, I think Facebook never allowed anonymity and never allowed anonymous accounts, which, I think for early internet utopians like us seems oppressive and terrible, but I think is actually, in some ways, the direction things are going again.
Yeah. Talk about, you mentioned, and it's a theme of the book, that a lot of these techniques really paved the way for the populist right and the kinds of abuses which were most expressed around the 2016 election, or in Trump's election. Explain that mechanism a little bit. How did BuzzFeed and Gawker pave the way for populist authoritarians?
Yeah, and this was, I guess, to me in the reporting of the book, the biggest surprise, and what the book wound up being about to some degree, which is you have this progressive Manhattan scene in the early aughts. But then if you kind of look closely at it, there are a bunch of characters. Chris Poole, who started 4chan, was working out of BuzzFeed's office. A guy named Gavin McInnes, who founded the Proud Boys, had co-founded Vice. Andrew Breitbart, big key figure of the early internet, was a co-founder of Huffington Post. And Steve Bannon talks about dropping by Huffington Post and looking over Jonah Peretti's shoulder to learn things. And in a way, they were better positioned than, one of the reasons that the internet was seen as progressive was just young people were on it. One was that the kind of Republican who was around in 2009, 2010, wasn't tapping these forces. Mitt Romney was not going viral. And that's in part because the real traffic on the right, and Breitbart and Bannon were the ones who kind of, to some degree, discovered this. The way to get traffic, that was to go directly tap these forces that not only society at large, but also specifically the Republican Party had kept at bay, being just overt racism. Breitbart had a black crime vertical, and fury about immigration at large, undocumented immigrants in particular. And they saw that that's where the traffic was, and they went right at it. And that, inspired this new movement, this new energy that the Republican Party had for decades sort of kept in a box, but had always been there, and they kind of opened it. And then the other thing that I think is so clear in retrospect, but was hard to see at the time, was that Facebook was shifting from being a place where you saw things that your friends shared to being a place that distributed content that drew engagement. That was their metric, engagement. Because they figured if you share something and all your friends like it, other people's friends will probably like it too. And then like is a funny word, engage with it. Click the like button, and then they realize, well, clicking the like button is enough. What if a comment in particular shows that you really are engaged? And where that went pretty fast was, like, I post a racist meme, you say you're a racist, I say no, you're a racist. They then show that to everyone in both of our social networks who all pile in. And the system says, wow, look at all this incredibly meaningful engagement on this piece of content. We should show it to everyone.
Yeah.
And that both distributed all this toxic stuff, but also for this generation of kind of outsider right-wing figures, Trump, but also Duterte and Bolsonaro, and this whole new generation of global right-wing populists. Their whole style was to show that they were outsiders by transgressing, by saying stuff that was overtly racist, sexist, crude, just confrontational, false, to pick these huge fights in public. Because it signaled, among other things, to their base, when CNN and the New York Times would come and wag their fingers, that signaled to their alienated followers that they really were outsiders, that they were outside the establishment. And this kind of deliberate transgressiveness inadvertently or coincidentally, but Facebook was just built to amplify that stuff.
Right.
Was built to amplify controversial statements. And so, I think it's easy to say, Facebook caused. I don't mean some causal, simplified story, but that was very much part of the fabric of those movements.
Well, if an authoritarian populist
Brexit also, I guess.
Yeah, first destroys the whatever independent media there is, as you see in a place like Philippines or Turkey, where it was very fragile at best. Then Facebook becomes the whole media. And Philippines is probably the most extreme example of that.
Yeah.
Where it was essentially any news you were going to get had to be on Facebook. And even Maria Ressa, who won the Nobel Prize and is the leading media opposition figure, started her publication on Facebook because that's where the whole country was, to a much more extreme extent than here. Yeah. Yeah,
and I think that platform was just tilted heavily toward amplifying, the most obnoxious speech that Donald Trump could think of was the thing that Facebook was built to spread in that era.
Right. And now Facebook's sort of like, never mind. That was a big mistake, having all that news on the platform. We're not going to do that anymore. Are they sort of... It makes me angry in a way that they cause this tremendous harm around the world and are now stepping back to a position not of we are going to be responsible about the news, but let's just not basically have any news because it just causes problems for us.
Yeah, I think it was a huge mistake, and it was a very specific mistake. What happened was Twitter in 2007 was very small and growing like this, and Mark Zuckerberg, who is intensely competitive, whose success has come from again and again copying rivals.
He said, I'll buy it, and if I can't buy it, I'll copy it.
Tried to buy it. Yeah. When he couldn't buy it, immediately cut off its access to all these Facebook services, and then tried to copy it, and started pouring news and sort of political controversy into Facebook to try to box out Twitter. I think if you go back, he should have said, wow, Twitter can have that stuff. This is a disaster.
Yeah. I'm very interested in the what was good, if anything, and what we learned, if anything, question. So when you look back on these range of publications, who were you rooting for at the time, and who ended up doing something valuable or admirable, and if so, what?
Yeah, I was at BuzzFeed, so I had my own skin in the game. But I think that I don't think their critiques of the established media were wrong. It was, elitist and closed off and disconnected from the way people actually communicated, among other things. And I think a lot of, and probably for better and for worse, but the great winner of that era is the New York Times. And the way the Times won in the end was partly by being patient as business models changed, but partly by absorbing a lot of the ideas, the techniques, and the people from all these new publications and opening itself up to a degree that it became unmanageable, actually.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, I do think that for better or for worse, a lot of the ideas that are in that book have sort of been reabsorbed by the legacy media.
And what would you, I mean, the Times had blogs for a long time. Now they don't have blogs. Now they are very good at newsletters. I mean, what were the things, other than the sort of tone and style, what did they learn from the kind of avatars of viral media?
Well, I think of it as social media in a way rather than viral media. But I mean, I think they learned to speak in sort of the normal language that people speak of on the internet rather than this kind of wooden, I mean, to some degree, a lot of the New York Times is still written in this very wooden language, but parts of it are in a more contemporary language. I mean, they also, gotta look at what their readers actually wanted to see and what they didn't, for better and for worse. Like, that basically killed the Metro section, which is too bad. But I think, I mean, the most powerful positive thing was that it met all these voices that had been totally shut out of, people who were not a specific, mostly white class of people who had gone to a set of schools and totally dominated the conversation, but also, in particular, non-Americans. Like, there's a kind of foreign correspondent journalism that was really only possible in the era before social media, where you could go to a country, make up whatever you felt like, and then put it in the New York Times, because you knew it was what a New York Times reader would want. That really has become impossible.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people reading the New York Times now, lifelong readers like myself, would say it is more polarized. The New York Times is less the voice of the sensible center and more a kind of participant in the political fight. And there's always, a debate about, do they put lies in quotation marks or not when they're talking about the Trump indictment. But do you see, how else has the New York Times been affected by the social media era?
I mean, again, I think it's like there was social media, there was societal polarization, and there was a shift to a subscription business model. And I think all three of those things push you really, really hard to say, wow, our core audience, as it always has been, is like my mom, a lifelong Democrat on the Upper West Side, and so who is not really in the sensible center or whatever you think you are. Like, she's a Democrat, and so they, I think those are all forces saying, wait, like, these are our bills-paying customers. We should be giving them what they want. And there is a pull in the other direction from the family that owns it, from its tradition. And then there's also Trump, whose style is to lie and challenge you to call him a liar. Right. It's a difficult position to be in.
But there is also the pressure of, as you say, a subscription-driven business or an audience-driven business, which the Times is now, versus an advertising business. Advertisers are more conservative, and a lot of what they want is to avoid certain kinds of controversy.
Right, as Michael Jordan apocryphally said, Republicans buy sneakers.
Yeah. He didn't really say that?
I think not. But he kind of, it's his point of view.
Yeah. Let's talk about a few more episodes. One thing I'm eager to bring up with you again, in which you were front and center, was the dossier, now known, I guess, as the Steele dossier. But when that was circulating underground in Washington, and for those of you who don't remember, this was a anonymous set of intelligence reports that purported to show that Donald Trump was, fundamentally a Russian spy, but that, he'd been, hired hookers in a Moscow hotel and so on. And it, was 30-something pages of, really juicy stuff. BuzzFeed decided to publish it. Still a hugely controversial decision in the history of journalism. When I was teaching a course in journalistic ethics, several of my students chose that as their final paper topic. And I will say, I supported your decision to do that. But what do you think about it now? Was it the right decision?
At the time, I felt very strongly it was the right decision, and now I feel very ambivalent about it.
Yeah.
But, the nature of the business is you have to make the decision in the moment. I was certainly coming from this kind of journalism that was, to some degree, about saying, screw the gatekeepers, they've done a bad job, and by the way, they can't control the gates if they even want to. and there's a level of respect for your reader who's a teacher or a lawyer or a construction worker, that like you don't have, as a journalist, some special skill. Like it's not like I can read this document and be safe, but if you see it, it will burn your eyes out. So to some degree, that's how I was thinking about it. When we got this thing, and we knew everybody in town had it, right? All the journalists, lots of elite journalists had it. Intelligence agencies and security officials, members of the Senate, members of the House, people in the White House. Like it was this. So and we're starting to make their decisions based on it. Harry Reid had said some stuff in public that was totally incomprehensible if you didn't know about this document. John McCain was acting in ways that, again, were hard to understand if you didn't know about this document. And yet, it was unverified, and we had also, like other outlets, sent reporters to Prague, to Moscow, trying to stand up or knock down the allegations and trying to find people at the Four Seasons Hotel to talk about the betting situation. I mean, and gotten nowhere. And
it was essentially unverifiable.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It was close. Yeah. I mean, in the end, parts of it were verifiable and were knocked down.
Right.
But it was, and so, I think the trigger for us was that CNN reported that the document had been briefed to the president-elect Trump and to the president Obama, and that so there was this super secret document prepared by a reputable Western intelligence figure saying the president-elect had been compromised, that had been briefed to two presidents. And I guess my view, and it still really is, that at that point, when you're saying, I have in my hand a list of communists in the State Department, you've sort of passed the point where you can also not show it to the audience. You cannot say that you have it. You cannot say that there's a reputable document that says the president's a spy. But once you've said it, you can't just wave it around and not show it. And I guess I thought, and you know what, people will, I have a lot of, I think if you talk to regular people who consume the news, regardless of education level, they're usually surprisingly thoughtful. And not surprisingly, they're thoughtful. They're as smart as you and me. Journalists don't have some special, skill in interpreting the world. And I guess I thought, people will see this and they'll be able to hold in their heads, this is really shocking allegation and it's unverified. Actually, it turned into this kind of talisman of kind of resistance, liberals saying this thing is proof of what we already knew, of Trump people saying this thing is proof of a deep state conspiracy. It wasn't really either. And it's funny because I realized WikiLeaks was very, very similar in a way of just becoming this talisman that meant whatever people wanted it to mean, kind of regardless of its specifics. I remember being at going to cover Trump in New Jersey in 2016, and there was a guy outside chanting with a sign, chanting WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks. And I had spent that morning reading through WikiLeaks and went up to him and said, hey, which were you talking about the stuff from the Gulf or the India? What are you talking about? And he had no idea. It was just sort of it says that she's correct.
Pro or con, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think if it happened again, it would be a really hard decision. As you say, on the one hand, it seems untenable if you're a journalist to be protecting your audience from information that is driving events. That's the argument for publishing it. But I thought my assumption was a lot of it would turn out to be true. At least 50% of it. And I think to date, essentially nothing in it has turned out to be true.
Yeah, there was some stuff that was known by the time he wrote it about the Russians supporting Bernie Sanders on social media and stuff that was true but kind of trivial, and the really lurid allegations were not true, and his sourcing, as it's been revealed, was garbage. Yeah. He had a lot of credibility in part because he'd been central to the investigation of FIFA. And the reporter who got the document
You're talking about Christopher Steele,
who
had a
great resume, and also our reporter who got the dossier had written a book about corruption at FIFA, and corruption at FIFA turns out to be real, and Steele had played a big role in that investigation, so he had a lot of credibility. But of course, that doesn't mean that the thing someone says is true.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was a happy ending, particularly.
So I'll open up for questions in one of it. I want to ask you one more, which is about the thing you're doing now, Semaphore. So after all of this disillusionment, you left the New York Times, where you were this widely read and influential columnist about the media, to do another digital startup. So why did you do that, and what's different this time?
Yeah, I can't remember. We were on some panel yesterday about AI, and you said of yourself that you're some kind of demented optimist. and I suppose that's sort of a personality flaw of mine too. But no, I mean, I think for all that was good and maybe mostly bad about social media, I do think that era is over, and it's been exciting to try to go back to this much older way of doing media, which is to find people who really want information told to them in a way that feels of this moment, is really sophisticated, is really transparent, is global, and talk to them directly with email is mostly how we reach people, which is both this kind of, which both drives me crazy because I'm such a creature of the internet. I'm used to, when I have a typo, being able just to quickly run in and fix it. When you have a typo in an email newsletter that goes to 50,000 people, you just get 10,000 emails saying, hey, did you notice you spelled the New York Times wrong, which I did last week? But other than that, unfortunately, AI is a good copy editor, so it doesn't happen that much. It's very exciting just to talk to your audience and literally know who you're talking to and people who chose to read you, and it's a very different, and it feels like there's an opportunity to help steer an audience that's very alienated from both the kind of crazy chaos of the news environment and of not being sure who to trust.
Does the Semaphore newsroom not care about traffic, or care about traffic in a different way? I mean, you're right. For a decade or so, that traffic was the number one word everyone talked about. Is traffic still the term of art?
I think we care about being read, of course. Every journalist always has, and traffic is, I suppose, a word for that. But no, I mean, we're much more focused on, I guess, conversions, or the new technical term of art, but of reaching people who want to stick around and want to read you again next week and like what you're doing and feel connected to your journalist, which is fun.
Yeah. What sort of scale do you aspire to? So in the when BuzzFeed was riding high, there were you could go see Mark Andreessen and he would say New York Times is finished, BuzzFeed is going to be much bigger now.
He doesn't say that anymore.
He doesn't say that anymore. But there was a moment. I mean, there was plenty of hype, but the aspirations or the ambitions were very large. The valuations were very large, reflecting the possibility that there might be something real about those ambitions. How's it working?
Yeah, and there was this illusion that media could be one of these tech businesses that just scale, like Facebook, that just over the course of a couple of years scales massively, and then figures itself out as a business because it's so large. And I think that's not how media works. That's not how news works. I think we are very, very ambitious about scale. We'd like to we think there's space for ultimately another global competitor to places like the Times and the BBC. But I think pretty realistic that that's a project of decades, not a couple of years, and are starting by trying to reach people who are really sophisticated and engaged around news, around kind of global news, with this one daily morning product called Flagship, and then in a series of niches: finance, tech and AI, media, U.S. politics, sub-Saharan African politics, just because I think the way news is organized now is very, very fragmented and very niche, whether you like it or not.
So what is Semaphore's sort of unique selling proposition as a news site or a news organization? What do you do that's different or innovative?
I guess I'd say two things. One is we're really transparent about who you're talking to. Like we were able to pick off, superstar journalists from places like the Post and the Wall Street Journal, but instead of writing in a kind of wooden news format where you're not really sure where the ideas are coming from, they're writing in their own voice. They're saying very clearly, here are the facts, here's my point of view. And then on the other side of the coin and through all of our products, saying, and here are all the other things from other outlets, including preferably thoughtful disagreements, so that you get the spectrum of analysis, and you don't have to, when you read something, as I do in a publication that I really like and appreciate, then Google the subject and read 7 other pieces so I can triangulate what's going on. And I think at a moment when people do feel that great publications like The Times are also much more ideological than they used to be, trying to be a bit of a counter to that.
So there's no ideological. Is there an ideological profile of your readers or of the publication, or are you attempting to be totally neutral?
Steve Bannon on his podcast the other day said that we were globalists, but did a pretty good job. So I'll take that.
So Steve Bannon, we used to.
Not a fan of ours, but.
Well, anyway,
we're still quoting from one of our stories.
Let's take some questions. Who has a question for Ben? I don't want to monopolize it here. Yes, we'll start here and move around. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a question about just for the stream about the business model for local news, for news in general. I do think local news is just harder than everything else. Local news in America was one of the best businesses in the history of the country for many years, where if you wanted to sell a mattress in Cleveland, you just 5% went to the Cleveland Plain dealer for marketing of every transaction in Cleveland and every other city, and just an unbelievably good business that employed hundreds and hundreds of reporters in every town, and it's very hard to see how you ever get back to it. I think if you look at every category, when people say American journalism is in trouble, which it is, they're talking exclusively about local. Everything else is doing better than it ever was. Investigations, national political news, business news, tech news, there's more of it than there ever was. But there's this huge crisis of local journalism that I think the answer is going to be a mixture of subscription and advertising, nonprofits, local television. I mean, all sorts of things, none of which ultimately add up to what you had in the 20th century. It's just, it's a huge problem. For us, we have these big ambitions, but have been burned and are pretty careful, and I think are starting by trying to reach these very specific niches, to try to reach central people in finance, in technology and AI, in Washington. And there's a sort of smaller but very serious business around, I guess you'd say that the term of art is corporate brand reputation advertising, but basically marketers for whom it's important to reach the sort of central players in an industry, whether because those are the people who buy enterprise software or because they're the people who pass legislation. And so that's sort of where we're starting and hoping to kind of broaden out from there.
Yeah, gentleman right behind you. Yeah.
Interested to know kind of what you think of media fatigue, in the sense that the folks who wake up to their iPad or their neighbor in the driveway and say to themselves, okay, who's killing who today? Who's lying to me today? Like, do I really even want to read this?
Yeah.
The question about media fatigue, something Ben inflicts, but it's not experienced.
I do not have that experience myself. I mean, not everybody does. John and I were just talking about how much media. A lot of people still consume media in the world, but I mean, I think that it is kind of a crisis for the Washington Post and the New York Times that everybody isn't like waking up at 6 a.m, rolling over and just like, what did Trump do today, in a state of total panic. I mean, that was not a healthy moment in American history. Maybe we're headed back into it. But I'm not sure that like that level of obsession with the news and a feeling that the news that your country is on the verge of an apocalypse and you need to consume news 24/7. Like, that was also not a great place to be. I think the trend that is, I think, really clear right now isn't so much fatigue as fragmentation. I mean, I think podcasts in particular are great, which his business are a great example of this, where you have thousands of really high quality podcasts out there. If you survey people, as somebody did recently, what's your favorite podcast? A lot of people don't know the favorite podcast, but for those who do, Joe Rogan, who's a kind of rightish weirdo interviewer, is number one. But he's only got 5% of the market. And so you've got a market where the biggest share is 5% and everything else is smaller. And so going from a world where everyone's on one of two platforms, Facebook and Twitter, seeing and fighting with each other about the exact same stuff, to a world where people are listening to totally different stuff, have no visibility into what other people are consuming. I mean, it's a very abrupt change, and I think I think we're part of that. Like, we're definitely looking to reach people, not necessarily with all 8 of our newsletters, but people who are super interested in a certain niche, and doesn't have to be tens of millions of them in each niche. And so I think a lot of publishers are seeing that trend and adjusting to it. And I think it's a little hard to figure out how it affects everything else in the world. But I think that is where we're headed, toward this fragmentation where people are looking for trusted voices, and they're not all going to be so mass. And meanwhile, everything else is getting smaller. Broadcast is getting smaller. Public radio is getting smaller. Cable news is shrinking. And what's growing are lots of other little things.
We have time for one or maybe 2 more quick questions. Anyone? Do I see any hands up? Oh, yes. There, sir.
Yeah, the question was about sort of local news and democracy, and yes, the reality that like we always romanticize the past, but actually often local news was terrible and in the pocket of local interests. That's true for sure, but I guess I do think that it is sort of strange and disorienting to be in these places where there's none. I mean, in New York, where my wife ran a local publication for years, which is incredibly satisfying journalistically, but a terrible, really incredibly hard business for the reasons I was talking about before. What you have increasingly is that the mayor has a big email list, and when he wants people to know something, he communicates with them directly, and that's the only place they're getting their news, and that's like kind of scary. And I mean, again, not that, as you say, not that the past was all that great, but I do think, I don't know, I think of local news to some degree as like a utility, like water or something. You just kind of need it to function, to keep places together. And there are kind of green shoots and leaves in some places, and the Vineyard Gazette is kind of an incredible exception to this trend, where you have a whole newspaper war here. It's amazing. But in a lot of communities, there's just nothing. And it's pretty disorienting.
Do you think the loss of that competition in most places is a big factor? I mean, you're a very competitive journalist. You like scoops. You like beating the competition. I've always seen that as a really healthy and necessary element of journalism, although it's one that readers don't necessarily see. But
yeah, it's actually something that drives me crazy, in particular about nonprofit media, which is a huge part of the answer and doing wonderful work. But there is a sense of we're all on the same side. We're all trying to do good in the world, and we're all going to divvy up America or divvy up different verticals and beats. But like, what if you are totally catastrophically wrong, which journalists sometimes are, and I do think that competition, partly because journalism is so hard to get things right in a day. Like, just often you're wrong. And that competitive tension is really important.
Yeah. I hope we've convinced you to go buy a copy of this incredibly entertaining and somewhat disturbing book. Ben, congratulations.
Thank you
very much. Yeah.
What do we do? That was fun.